Hello there, I'm Deep Dhillon, your host, and today on your AI Injection, we welcome Adam Binnie. Adam is the Chief Innovation Officer at Visier. Adam applies AI to people analytics, transforming how businesses understand and optimize their workforce. Adam, thanks so much for coming on the show. Maybe get us started off today by telling us what problem Visier Analytics solves, and perhaps start by walking us through what people did before the product arrived and how that's different using Visier Analytics.
It's a great question, Deep. Maybe a 3-hour conversation in itself that I'll probably try to avoid and summarize.
Do the GPT-4 summary version.
GPT-4 summary. So what problem are we trying to solve? We fundamentally think that, and we look at the world, use of information, data-driven behavior and stuff has been, amazing around process. And then it was, the 90s, the 80s, and 90s, very much around process optimization. The last 20 years, we've had a lot of focus around customer and customer process and customer listening. And, we think the next big threshold, next big opportunity in productivity is around employee. So that's kind of the world we look at it. And we think that people data, or data about your workers, your employees, your associates, or whatever, however you describe the people that do the work for you in your organization, that people data is business data. We think that people are what drives business impact and creates change and opportunity. So we're very focused on that world of people data. Like, how do we take that people data and use it to create impact, create enhanced productivity, increase employee satisfaction, create better employees, create better managers, create better companies, right? That's the world we're in. So the second part of your question is, what was there before us? When I joined Visier even 10 years ago, the idea of using all that people data to help drive better outcomes for the business was fairly novel. And many organizations just didn't do it. They, the people organization, HR, they would advise on social and cultural things, but they didn't really use a lot of data in that process. And I think there were a bunch of really amazing innovators that came along. I think we were one of those innovators, but there's been lots of people out there that have talked about like the really early days of taking people data and using it to improve employee experience and employee effectiveness and manager effectiveness. And so, we sort of have been part of that journey. And today, we're delivering that capability at scale to an organization. And it's not about, some aspect where it's about providing very key insights to decision makers, so executives. But we ultimately, our passion is, how do we bring that to the manager, to the employee, so that we get this huge impact at scale from this information, from this insight. So, are people being effective? Are they doing the right work? Are they in the right role? Is there another opportunity for them in the organization? What is their continued relationship with the company going to be? That's where our heart and soul is. How do we bring this people data out and create real impact to the business, real impact to the people? We like to say that, people have a huge impact on business. I mean, you want to understand how your people impact your business, but you also want to understand how your business impacts your people.
Yeah.
It's kind of true.
I mean, that all makes a lot of sense. Maybe to make it a little more real, let's maybe walk us through, like, what are the inputs to the system? So you're signing up a new company. What are they plugging into it? I assume at a minimum you need the employee roster, but you maybe have other data sources, maybe like ADP data, maybe, I don't know. Walk us through some of those inputs. What kind of sensors do you have? Are you tracking or connected to like email responses and Slack and other things? Maybe walk us through both the implicit feedback and the explicit feedback. Implicit, maybe how documents are moving to the entity through the organization. Explicit, maybe you're sending out specific forms and gathering data. So maybe just walk us through those inputs and the sensors.
And there's 3 big clumps of data. There's 100 ways to look at the data sources that we ingest. But the first one is probably, I would say, declarative data around the employees. So, information that's stored formally about the employees. What's their job? Where do they live? What do they work? What is their desk location? How much are they paid? Who do they work for? Imagine all of that information. And that exists across an entire landscape of the employee lifecycle, from potential candidate to an actual candidate for hire to, an active new employee being, onboarded to a fully tenured employee to an alumni, right? And so there's lots of different systems in that journey that we bring data in that sort of takes that core employee record and adds all of this insight around it. So, why were they hired? What did they do before? What could they do next? How much were they paid? How overtime did they do last week if they're on an hourly schedule or, salaried, maybe what bonuses they're getting and so on. So there's this huge gamut of that sort of very factual information. And then the second set you have is what I was called more qualitative information. So, it may be that you're surveying for engagement or you're bringing in understandings of cultural norms or attitudes to the organization or performance reviews. Frankly, they're all essentially, human gathered opinion from either the employee on the company or managers on the employee or the employees on the manager and so on. And then the last is behavioral data, where you may be recording what work people do, what projects they're on, and we may be looking at, documents being worked on together, who collaborates with who. We're looking at, we may have some sensors around, what's going on in their communication, how much communication do they have, with whom and in which functions, both inside the organization in some cases and outside the organization in some cases. So we may be looking at, who does a salesperson interact with? What type of job titles do they talk to? We may be looking at a new employee onboarding and asking, how well are they getting attached to the various networks that exist throughout the company? And so there's this quite a broad range. And of course, every one of our customers does it slightly differently, and they have slightly different sets of that. And it is an enormous range, hundreds of different systems that we touch and pull data from. Our average customer is probably loading data from 6 to 8 different core systems that they pull data from. But we have customers that are upwards of 60 plus systems that they pull data from. I hope that sort of gives you a sense. This is very...
Oh, no, this is awesome. It gives us a good sense of what you're gathering, both on the implicit and explicit side. Maybe another lens you can walk us through is, what are the user types and what do their dashboards look like? So you mentioned the manager, there's the employee. How do they interact? Is it a desktop thing? Is it a phone thing? Is it both? What causes them to jump in and engage and give some feedback? Is it triggered by performance review? Is there something like a regular cadence, like a weekly drop of some kind of temperature check, like they're happy, not so happy with their job, like whatever? Yeah, walk us through the dashboards for the manager, the employee, and maybe there's like an executive dashboard or something. What's the intel they get out, and what's the info they put in?
This is I always think about that the audience is a little bit maturity curve for our customers, right? The more mature, the further down the audiences they go. But where does most people start? They usually have a very targeted business problem. There may be a very focused team or area, but generally it stays for our customers. It starts usually with the people function, looking at being able to articulate some very, very core and foundational metrics and being able to really understand the organization that they have, and focused on things like, where are we losing people that are critical? How well are we effectively hiring the people where they're critical? That kind of question. And then the second audience, typically from that sort of focus team, inside the HR function, it will typically broaden and go to executives. So the executive decision makers, what are those big decisions that need to be made? How are we going to fix our, if we have issues with diversity, where are they and how do we fix them? If we're having real challenges hiring, where are we having challenges and what are we going to do about it? We're having issues with retention. Who's at risk and what could we do to change that reality? Those are some of the really foundational things. And so that would go out to executives. And of course, there are a whole gamut of business problems to be solved at that level. And then typically that's where the organization steps into that next step of maturity around scale. And the next level of scale may be to leverage the HR's natural alignment to what you might call general management, the overall management tier. So maybe not the top executive tier, but the more broad management tier, where in most organizations there's a job function called an HR business partner. Their job is to articulate people strategy and consult and advise the business on how best to leverage its people. And so that may be the next audience. And then ultimately, when you have that conversation, there's two users coming in there, the HR business partner and the business partner, who are both getting very involved. That's management. And then the next tier is first line managers. First line managers is, I've got a small team of people and I need to understand the issues. As you get out to that layer of the organization, of course, you're dealing with people who don't have time to learn product. They're not going to spend a lot of time learning this. It kind of needs to just work for them. And that's a big focus right now for us with generative AI, right? We're thinking generative AI and a very simple conversational AI experience is a really great way for us to reach broader out to that layer of the organization. And then ultimately, we also want to help employees themselves. Most employees want to know what their manager sees and understand how they're perceived and potentially have an opportunity to improve their career. So we also have a layer of the product which serves the employee, but that's typically in this very narrow, closed sort of feedback loop around who are you collaborating with and who are you being effective with. So you're sort of getting peer feedback, and that's part of our the sort of that employee level of the conversation. But so we think about organizations trying to go from that central executive layer all the way out through managers to the employees to get to ultimate scale of bring these insights out where it matters. I was having a great chat with one of our healthcare customers on Monday about our generative AI solution that they're getting ready to roll out into production. They see lots of people going to use that. Executives will use it. HR business partners will use it. But their ultimate dream is, can a nurse manager on a ward use it to identify, who else might be able to help in a crisis situation when they're missing, a nurse or a particular specialty, or they need to actually make sure that they've got the right staffing or the right kinds of employees or the right kind of hiring going on to be able to sustain a ward. That's somebody who, lives in a world where we can't send them training. They can't have, they could have a destination experience, but, they're not going to learn it. It has to be super simple. So that's kind of our spectrum. And then of the users, and then to support that spectrum of users, we have lots of different ways to interact with the insights. So the core of Visier is, of course, this huge body of knowledge that's being beautifully well organized, is highly consistent across lots of organizations, and is really standardized so that we can benchmark and compare and provide all that insight. But you can interact with it through dashboards, highly summarized sort of presentation. You can interact with it through conversational AI. You can interact with it through what we call guidebooks, which are these sort of narrated stories that tell you and explain how to use the information, how to action on it, what it means to you. We have a very power sort of analyst tool called Explore, where people can go and create those assets, those stories, those dashboards, but they can also just browse data in a very more structured way. We can generate things that are essentially pushed into your email, so people get an email connection, and of course that leads them back very often on mobile, so they get their email, they can click it, and then they can go into that fuller experience. So we have a footprint on Microsoft Teams, all of those different ways to get to this insight. And there's, of course, because you have this huge range of audience, you're not serving one person, you're serving this hugely different group of people, and they will have slightly different needs and ways they want to get to the information.
So when it comes to AI and machine learning, are we talking about leveraging a natural language interface to automatically generate queries into some business analytics system or a data warehousing system? Is it something like that? Or are we talking about something else?
We use machine learning in multiple ways. We've had a lot of data science in the product for a long time. We use it to generalize benchmarking. We create predictions and risk around like how likely people are to turn over or what might be great roles for them. So we have lots of different use cases in that sense, categorization, normalization. But today, one of the things we're rolling out very much is that generative AI using a large language model to give us that natural language query. We are using a mechanism where we are making sure that data stays safe and secure, that there's no exposure of that data to the large language model. This is really important in people data. Large language models aren't very good at filtering what you're allowed versus what I'm allowed. If it's in the model, it's sort of accessible.
Yeah. Are you guys running your own models, or are you going to like OpenAI after anonymizing your data or something?
We're actually using Azure GPT-4 Turbo right now as a large language model, but we don't need to train it on a customer's data. So we don't need to, like you said, we have anonymized and generalized the data for all our customers. We have a really robust standardized model, and we understand the structure. So essentially we use the large language model to do the translation of the question. What were you asking?
Yeah,
all the engineering, all that kind of stuff. That generates a robust query that is still going against their security system. So we know that you can or cannot see this. So you can ask a question like, what is Deep's current pay? And Visier would say, I know what you're asking, but I'm not going to answer that question because you're not allowed to know the answer to that question.
But you might ask something a little bit more anonymized, like of my team of data scientists, what's the average pay or something like that. So,
if you've been given permission to see that, then Visier would answer that question. That's something we've always done, the ability to provide aggregate views without detail. But again, the idea of like, let's say you could ask, if you ask Visier a question, there's a lot of questions that we don't even want you to know that there is an answer, right? So there's that kind of whole secure privacy kind of aspect. But that's because what we're doing is we're using the LLM to construct a question, not construct the answer. So Visier then answers that question back. And we can use a secondary LLM in a very non-persistent way, so not training it, to take that out and re-summarize it.
Presumably, pre-GPT and LLMs, you already had your product representing employee data in a way that enabled you to, query across these aggregations and get these kinds of summarizations. And the LLM is really a transformation layer into that query, whereas maybe before or in addition, in other features, those are formulated maybe in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, historically, you would have a very structured navigation, right? Filter this, down on that, pick this from a list, right? What the LLM is letting us do is to go, you don't need to learn how all of those controls work anymore.
Yeah.
It's the question you have. But it also, we start to see language chaining, right? So we're saying, take this question, and this question, and the LLM can also chain those together. So it might not be one question, one query. It might be a series of queries where Visier is taking, ask this question, get the response. The LLM uses the response to get the next question, and so on. So you can get chaining and all this kind of stuff. So you can ask really quite complicated questions and be offered back something. And also then led to like something we've always done, right, is we don't want dead ends. When people use data to make decisions or get informed, you get one answer and it almost always leads to another question. So we kind of want to have that continuous, that conversational experience, which we've always sort of had in that formal navigation, now also in this sort of informal sort of chat model where we're like, oh, did you mean this? What about that? Do you want to go and do something? And so we always find people like, oh, wait, I want to know how many people work for me. 7. Okay, but okay, who's the most highly paid and who's most likely to leave? And I've always got
what are the questions somebody else in my context might have asked?
Yeah.
Have a ton of data, don't know where to start? Chat with one of our principal data scientists at xionyx.com. That's XYONIX.com. You'll talk to an expert, not a salesperson. So I'm curious how you measure the effectiveness of the LLM, or whether you do, specifically in the transformation to the structured queries. Do you have a training data definition process that you go through to maybe random sample across the questions that people are asking in natural language, and then what are the actual structured queries that got generated from that, and then having some human or another LLM go through and figure out whether those were correct mappings or not, and then measuring efficacy in a more, in a traditional sense?
So there's sort of 3 pieces to that today. One of the things is we have a lot of history of the questions people were trying to ask, and they're not in the same form, they're not in natural language form. But the basic truth, we already know that. But right now, the way the product works is when you ask a question, it's going to give you an answer. It's also going to give you alternatives to sort of help lead you in that conversation to maybe where you were trying to ask the question. It also has a feedback mechanism, so you get to say, yes, this worked, or no, it didn't. So we get a lot of very direct end users. This solved their problem, or it did not solve their problem, which, is a common sort of practice. And then for the user themselves, we also have okay, if you don't really understand what you got, the answer is 42. Okay, but did you really know what the question was? Then we also provide explanations of why we chose that and what we were trying to do. And again, that whole process of creating that better relationship between the user. We're focusing on users in a lot of cases who don't know if the answer is right or wrong. There's a huge trust building exercise with every user to make sure that they feel confident that not only do they get an answer, but if they wanted to, they could make sure that they had the backing to explain where that answer came from. So that if they're challenged by, if somebody says to you, okay, how many people work for you? And you said 42, and somebody says, well, are you sure? You can say, well, I can show you the 42. I can give you the list. I can give you the background material. So again, building trust, because unlike if I'm asking a co-pilot to generate a document for me, I'm going to read the document afterwards and make the final decisions. A lot of the times our users I don't know if those answers, that's factual data coming from a system. I need to know that it's correct factual data. So we're creating a lot of that feedback loop. And then obviously using that to continuously refine and retrain and build up the correct connection. So that, okay, yes, when you ask that question in that form, you want it output in that shape.
It seems like you can kind of mitigate the LLM hallucination problem, because person asks the question, you translate into your internal structured query that you think was the question they asked. You could even have a natural language description of that structured question. And then when you come back to answer, you can say, the answer to the structured thing that you thought they asked is this. Now you can't actually say anything. You can incorrectly map the question, but you don't have to worry about LLM hallucination really in that context.
We don't at all, right? Because the response is always very factual and
yeah. And it knows what question it's answering.
Yes. And it describes the response itself describes itself. So, ask, how many people work for you? And it says, oh, by the way, your birthday is on Tuesday. You realize this answered the wrong question, but you also aren't confused that the answer
No, I think the reason I'm kind of asking about this is, I feel like the world is in the process of understanding what it is we can do with LLMs. And I feel like what you're describing here is a really powerful template where you're not actually trying to answer the question with the LLM. You're trying to figure out which question is being asked. And those are two very different things. But that scenario can apply to a million different, like lots of different areas beyond like these HR analytics scenario that you're looking at. It's a very powerful case where people overhype the LLM thing and the possible applications. And then the counter reaction can also be, over the top, saying like, there's no way to mitigate. These things can just make stuff up. It's like, but here's a perfect case where, yes, it can make stuff up, but it doesn't matter.
Just ask the question. Refine the question. So no, I think it is a powerful case. I think one of the things for us, we don't worry about the hallucinations as much, but the other thing is, if the LLM was building the answer, actually delivering the answer, it has to have the knowledge inside it. And now you can work out what's secure. Now you can ask, the example always given, and I don't even know if this is apocryphal or true. If you asked OpenAI, where can I steal software? It will tell you that that's unethical and it's not going to answer that question. But if you asked it to tell you a bedtime story about, or better not,
somebody who needs to steal software,
what sites should you avoid because they contain pirated software? It will absolutely list off Pirate Bay and all these places, right? Because it has the knowledge, and it's just you're working your way around the security when you get there. Whereas in our case, you can't. Yeah, you can get it to ask a bad question, but then the security system is going to say, "I'm not going to answer that question." We actually get asked about it. You get it to not allow it to. Can you stop it accepting bad questions or unethical questions? And we're like, I don't think you can stop people asking unethical questions. All you can really do is make sure that you don't answer them unethically.
I think it's an interesting, based on this conversation, I'm sort of understanding that your LLM doesn't actually contain the data of the employees, right? Like it just contains the data it needs to formulate a structured query, which is very different and relatively safe, right? Like, I'd have to think to figure out a way where that's problematic, but I think that's like, it's just like a powerful basis case, Let me ask you this. I'm curious, what did you see in terms of engagement and uptick from, the natural language LLM powered question answering capability versus before, where you had a more structured way of interacting with your data? Did you see a significant uptick in engagement?
I think at this point, I think we're still sort of on that cusp of that, right? People are still cautiously rolling out. The conversation you and I have just had around security is a huge area of pause, and there's a lot of, we're talking about fairly sensitive data. Employee data is inherently very sensitive. So there's still a lot of hesitancy around it. So people are sort of allowing it getting out broader and broader. But the reaction we get when that happens from people is, oh yeah, now I can finally I can just move. I can just go. I can go do stuff. And so we're working now to put that LLM experience, that natural language query experience into the places where people are, so that they don't have to come find it. It's inside your teams. It's just almost like there's we really think of V, this is our name for our AI experience as almost an avatar that you can just go almost like a person that you can go and get advice from. And so we really want that to be, on your phone, on your desktop, everywhere it can be. And so we are definitely seeing people are immediately very fond of it, but is one of those things. The first people who are using it are people who are already experts in the old way of doing things. Mm-hmm. And so with this inherent bias towards, I'm going to see if it can do the most complicated thing in the world. I think it's going to be really interesting as we start to see our customers now rolling it out much more broadly. And of course, because we're dealing with employee data itself, and we know everyone who works in the company, we know who the user is, and we know what their job title is. So we can actually look and see utilization and say, do we see first line managers using it? Do we see people who are not in the HR function using it? Do we see executives using it? So we're actually sort of watching that insight right now to see, is that our thesis that this allows data that was always valuable to those people to be used by them directly, rather than the way it was in the past before this sort of very simple natural language experience was, I just emailed or I texted the analysts in HR and said, can you send me my... And
I think that's the metaphor, right? Like, if there's somebody's an expert in a sophisticated tool, you're trying to get, somebody who's not an expert in it goes to that person, gets them to interact with the tool and get them the results they want. In this case, the machine learning, the AI system is trying to serve as that person. I think Google Analytics recently released something that's kind of similar, right? Like, analytics is quite powerful, and you have to spend a fair amount of energy to really figure out how to manipulate and get all these different permutations and data results that you might need. But now you can sort of quickly just get to your actual analysis and get those results. Let's maybe take a little bit of a turn to some of the more non-generative AI problems that you mentioned before. So I think you mentioned churn prediction. Walk me through because a lot of our listeners are folks who are trying to figure out how to leverage machine learning and AI in their products. So there's a lot of product managers, a lot of technology managers, maybe people familiar with more traditional software development. And the question I have is walk us through how you determine what use case is worthy of a machine learning or AI solution. Maybe not the generative AI case, but these specific ones we really want to figure out how to get a churn model in. We really want to figure out how to get, maybe a loyalist model in. And how does that work from a product standpoint, with your product folks? How do you find the problem? How do you, maybe organizationally find the solution path? And then how do you get started? Do you prototype first? All that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think we have some good fortune from some good decisions a very long time ago, in that we have, 48,000 companies that all use exactly the same foundational data model. And that means that we have, again, anonymized and aggregated vast seas of data that we kind of know the shape. And we're dealing with we deal with the practice and in the people practices in organizations extremely consistent across industry areas of the world. So we've been lucky that we have this very robust set of data that we can learn from. And I think that's always an enabler that you need to have. You need to have consistent data that's normalized. So okay, all these people's job levels are roughly the same meaning, and all these people's job titles are the same job occupations, and that all these locations are the same, where they actually are. So there's all this sort of work that happens on the data side. But once you have all that data, so that was sort of just there for us, then the business problem solutions get a lot easier, because you can really walk into a business problem, which is quite easy to articulate, which is highlight areas where, again, risk of X, can create me a machine learning that's just using historical turnover and projecting forward a prediction of who's most likely to behave the same way. And again, that is a relatively clear value to people because it's helping to inform them. You can also use all that data to come up with all kinds of things. Now, in the people space, where we really struggle a lot is being very careful around the ethical boundaries. Because, there is a lot of sensitivity. Making promotion recommendations or hiring recommendations is extremely risky and extremely fraught with problems. So we've sort of, in some cases, that's been more of our consideration than perhaps the technical challenges of coming up with a machine learning example. But in other places, for example, inside the product, we can have very small features that use this capability. So, for example, we have a whole bunch of machine learning driven decision making around what counts as an exception, what counts as something that needs you to be informed. So we can sort of generate insight that is pushed to you when we think that the set of data has created a trigger condition, right? You're an outlier change in some value, an unusual reality, a problem with where something has suddenly changed. So we have a lot of that kind of activity, but they're all, in that case, there's lots and lots and lots of examples, but they're all fairly easy for us to implement because we're working from this very robust foundation. Where we struggle more is when you need to go all the way back to get the data. So for example, we do a lot of career pathing. So we're looking at, where an employee's career might go. And, we do this across an incredible, huge body, 25,000 employees. But when we wanted to go and do that across that community, we needed to go get people's job histories, like not just their job histories inside the company, but job histories outside the organization. And we needed to do an awful lot of normalizing of that data so that when that model gets generated, it is much more robust and it's reliable. And so that gets much more difficult and much more expensive, because if you have to go back and get the data and you haven't had it in the past, that is have to touch every customer, have to talk to everybody, have to make sure that they have it, have to make sure that it again gets normalized. And so that gets into a much more complex, much more expensive feature. So there's kind of that trade-off exercise between, yes, we can see the value. Do we have the data? How do we get the data? And if we don't, and how reliable is that data going to be? Now, in some cases, we can get data from outside the world, from the outside world, and buy data if you like. But generally, the best problems are solved when we can actually get robust, well-cleaned, reliably maintained data into the system.
Not sure how to make your AI system safe and responsible? Our team provides personalized insights into how AI can be safely and effectively implemented in your business, identifying both opportunities and potential pitfalls. Take our free risk assessment by Googling Xionics testing. So a lot of our listeners are kind of want to understand the mechanics organizationally, like in your org, how it might happen. So like, let's say a product manager decides like, hey, we have the ability to predict who's likely to leave, but we also want to understand, the attributes of somebody who is likely to stay for a long time. So how does that work organizationally? The product manager has the idea. Do they have the autonomy to go grab their data scientists, pull the historic data out, explore a model, explore an explainable form of that model, get that feature somehow kind of prepped, and then they're deploying it across all of your customer base? Like how do you carve out that type of work across a set of product? It sounds like you guys are a fairly decent size, across a set of product managers and teams.
Yeah, so our world, okay, maybe useful to explain a little bit about how we structure that sort of product management. So we essentially have two layers of product management. So we have a layer we call solution management that lives in the domain of the business problem. So that you would say they're HR knowledgeable about HR. They understand how the HR teams are working. They understand how people works. They understand how management works. That's kind of their background. They're sort of subject matter experts deeply into the business problem. They live in the land of this is the business problem to solve. We're trying to solve for, pay to stay. What are the criterias that can we guesstimate how much more likely this pay rise or that pay rise would have on somebody's retention rate, right? So that when we're making pay recommendations, right, we know a lot, right? We know a lot about how comp ratios and feelings of fair compensation and behavioral stuff impacts that. But as they're getting into that kind of decision, so they're coming up with a business problem, they're articulating more of what would be useful, what would be helpful. But they're not data science experts. They're not really even like, how is the data engine going to service all of this kind of problem? So then they would take that to the product management team, where there are specialist product managers who really spend all their time in with the data scientists coming up with, how to productionize a piece of science. How would they validate and make sure that we are ethical? How would we validate and make sure the data is good enough, that we have quality, that we're not bleeding over sensitive information and stuff? So they would basically create the business problem, pass it down, and then they would create the technical problem, which would then go off to the data science team. And possibly, when we think about data science products, I have this really simple framework. There are 4 things you need to do well to deliver a data science product. You really need to have a good problem. And you need it well described. And that's that kind of solution manager's problem. You need data, and you need someone who knows the data that you need. you probably need data science. So you probably need the ability to take algorithms and know the right algorithms to apply, the right models to use. And so that's kind of where the data scientist and the product manager, the more technical product managers get involved with what approach are we going to take, and do we have the data? And if we don't, where are we going to get it? And then finally, you've got a software engineering element, which is how are you going to do this at scale for 1 million users across 15,000 organizations, right? So, what is going to be the reliability? Who's going to get it? How does it run at scale? So in our world, we actually have an entire part of our back-end servers that runs this sort of data science environment. And it connects all those 50,000 customers into a sort of a shared area where, again, we're very careful. Data doesn't bleed across that boundary, but where we can implement very quickly these core functions, these core capabilities, and then they can be leveraged by the customer applications. And then, we're still a business. So at some point when we create something new like that, that solution manager would then deal with packaging it, marketing it, explaining it to customers, and then obviously we'd go out and sell it to people as another thing that they can add to their capability set. Does that make sense, Steve? Like,
absolutely. No, that's exactly what I was kind of looking for. And I think you described a world where that makes sense, why that would work. It's also a place where a lot of our listeners kind of struggle because, not all companies have this sort of deeper technical data science-y kind of DNA in them that knows how to operationalize machine learning and AI capabilities. And what you're describing here, they almost always have what I forgot what you call them, your more solutions oriented, the domain expert type of product managers. They will definitely have those. But what you're describing is somebody who can translate that desire into data science conversation that where you can go talk to some data scientists and actually, as well as the back-end engineers and the other folks involved in the process. I think that helps a lot. Yeah. Thanks a ton.
I spent like 30 years in analytics, and obviously a really exciting time in analytics right now as generative AI really, up levels the whole conversation. But we've been driving data driven for 30 years. I think one of the things that's interesting as a product manager in that space is, analytics is a little bit of a separate beast. It's a bit like, if you're a product manager for, say, a word processor, right, versus a product manager for an enterprise app, right? Enterprise apps are very workflow oriented. You can sort of see users going down a very linear path, a website production, very linear path. Like you can sort of think about it as step. But a word processor doesn't have, first press the K key, then the G key, right? And analytics is a bit this sort of canvas world where I don't know the question you're going to ask. And anything I build for you, a dashboard I'm going to build for you, is going to last a couple of months before you want a better one, right? So you have this short durability. So you have this kind of whole very fast evolution of content, which is really different to, say, most app building. And I think this is where a lot of application product managers struggle because they're looking for this very golden path.
Well, there's also a lot of uncertainty in it, right? Like, not everything has signal. I mean, I'm sure there exist questions that you want to predict for employees that you just don't have enough signal. And then there's maybe some gray areas. There's like a spectrum of cases where, we can predict it, plus or minus 3%, maybe 92% efficacy. There's other ones where you're down in the 60s or 50s or, God forbid, below. And then there's a balancing act. Like, well, when is it good enough to bother rolling out to our customers, and how do we even expose some of that uncertainty? Maybe that's the question I have for you. Like, how do you think about exposing the error rates to your customers for something? Let's take something like churn, right? You know that you can predict it with X% efficacy plus or minus something. How do you communicate that to your users? And how do you think about communicating it to them?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those user maturity questions, I guess, because you deal with a lot of different user personas, and there's a layer of users where you could they would understand error bars, if you like. Mm-hmm. And there's an other layer that's just noise, just confusion. And so it's a really interesting balancing act. I'd love to say I had a beautiful answer to that question, but the truth is it's a constant dilemma because the love of simplicity and the love of just give me the answer I want. Just tell me it's 42, good enough, right? Like I don't even need to know why.
The problem is sometimes it's going to be 47, and then they come back and they're like, "Hey, you said 42, and now you've deteriorated the trust." Whereas, but yeah, either way, the trust is going to take a hit, But at least in one case, you can say, "I never said it was 42. I said it. I think it's 42 plus or minus X or Y."
the plus and minus is really interesting. You'll see organizations go, okay, well, my engagement score was, an 82, right? And then next time they run it, it's 81. And so he's like, oh my God, it dropped a point. And you're like, yeah, but it's got an error of ±5. Like, but we won't tell you it's ±5 because that's noisy. But now you've got somebody who's, seeing like micro change and not realizing that's well within the bounds of just statistical noise. You also see people, you'll see people who insist that everything comes to the cent, but you're not really measuring cents, right? You're guesstimating costs, right? What's the cost of replacing an employee? Well, it's sort of in the 150 grand range. Okay, it's not $146,312.13, right? And yet you'll see that presented to people. I think that's been an ongoing problem with analytics and sort of that analytical awareness that what's directional, what's informing, what's really just a range. But we still deal with a lot of people, like a lot of users who, if you gave them a range, they're like, well, where is it in the range? Like, it's like, well, I'm giving you a range because I can't tell you that, but now you're like,
that is a constant challenge. I mean, I think it's a place where, really good user experience folks can bring a lot of value in saying like, hey, if it's 42.2 and 42.3, sometimes in 39.8, we're going to just round to 42 because I don't want to confuse them. Where the engineers are like, no, you have to show the exact thing plus the error bounds. And then they can argue in a room for a while and eventually, something comes out. I want to jump up a little bit and just talk about the macro findings that you have with respect to employees, and because you have a very interesting perch where you're looking at quite a bit of employee happiness data. What are some of the things that really surprised you in the last few years? Around that your engine has taught you about what makes employees happy and what doesn't, makes them unhappy, or what works or doesn't. What chases them out the door? Like, what are some big surprises you found?
There's some big surprises we found. We actually have if you went to Visier.com, you went to the research end, there's one of my teammates, Andrea, who has produced some really amazing research on all kinds of topics. One of the things we see in our industry is there's this very interesting swing, right? The market swings, everyone can't find people, hiring's a nightmare, they're spending a fortune trying to get people in the door. They're doing everything to retain people. They're, incredible investments in learning and development. And then, the market suddenly flips. And then it's like, it's like they're working out how to let people go. And, you sort of see these huge swings. And of course, COVID, the last economic crisis, all of these have had these huge swings in terms of this reality for organizations. And I think organizations really struggle with that because they're trapped in that reality. But at the same time, that isn't really the best way to do things, right? So they're kind of struggling with that. So we've got a lot of research on different things. We've got research on, on how that works. And you can see other things that are sort of subject to those huge shifts, focuses on diversity. COVID was a disaster for diversity, absolute disaster. We'd love to say that we're gender neutral when it comes to who gets to stay at work. But the reality is that most home care is provided by women. And so as a result, diversity in the workforce dropped dramatically during that period of time. So we see a lot of that. We actually do this research on a monthly basis. We're constantly publishing some of that research. If I spin back in my head, the one I most enjoyed, I think perhaps was most, I don't think it really taught us anything, but it was really interesting to see it in data, is pay equity is really not a simple function of male and female in the same role. Because the promotion history for male and female is so dramatically different through their age groups. So in the 20s, males tend to get promoted a lot faster. As a result, they're at a higher level. So yes, they're earning more than they're essentially where, people who started at the same place. And then what's interesting, it rapidly flips in the late 30s where women suddenly get this huge acceleration in their careers again. And so it's really, that was a fascinating piece of research that we did. So we have lots of that, right? We're doing it all the time and it's well worth going to. I was actually joking with one of my colleagues the other day that, one of my proudest moments last year was that one of those pieces of research showed up in Men's Health. Now, as a software company, being in Forbes or in Harvard Business Review was obviously our kind of goal, but being picked up by something so obscure as Men's Health because it was talking about burnout and use of stress and how stress was affecting people at work. So we've done a ton of that kind of research and it is really fascinating to see. And we actually publish like voluntary turnover rates and what's changing in that, which is people quitting on our website every single month with like constantly updating what's happening in the world of turnover and retention and stuff like that. So there's lots of that stuff.
Yeah.
I'm probably the best person to interpret that. We have a whole team of people that do that. And then I said, I read it just like everybody else because it's fascinating to see these huge macro trends and also how that impacts people in the workforce as a result.
Yeah, I imagine you guys are just in an interesting position because you're seeing not just one company, but like, can't remember that number you said, but it was quite a decent number.
50,000. Yeah, almost 1,000. I'm probably going to double that next couple of years. So it's going to be exciting.
My favorite last question is like, if we jump out 5-10 years into the future, if all of these sort of advanced ideas that you and your team have, get implemented and, your product is able to do kind of everything that you want, how does the world look different from an employee vantage and maybe from a manager vantage?
Well, I think on the really positive, I'm trying to decide if I go negative or positive first. Because I think there's some really big challenges ahead of us. I think generative AI creates some really interesting societal challenges that second and third order problems, not just, oh my God, I'm going to lose my job, but like second, third order problems. But let me go there second. I think the first thing for us, like the journey I think we're on is, how does our AI become a true companion, a coach, something that knows when I care, why I should care, and helps me actually learn and develop into being better at what I'm trying to do. And in our world, of course, that's very focused on a manager. How do I make managers better managers? Not a ton of science out there for how to be a better manager, how to lead people, how to develop people. And there's lots of guidance and you can ask people to help you. But to be honest, it's a skill set that we basically say, you're a manager today. And if you suck at it, you'll stop you being a manager in a year or two, right? After you've probably lost half your team. And so I think that's kind of my dream, is like, how do we get that? And then how do we get a lot of science around that, right? So that we actually know the right things to do, and recognizing that that's a hyper-personalized reality, because what works to manage one employee doesn't work to manage the next employee. So it's never as simple as you just, big bowls, sort of everyone do it the same way stuff. So that's kind of I think that's the dream we're driving towards, how to make people more effective as managers. And then obviously make their teams more successful, more competent, more high performing. I think one of the challenges we're going to see in the near future, though, just to look back on another way, is how do we create learning environments when you've got something able to do the early part of a job? So what you look at AIs today, and we're very clear. If you want up to journeyman level writing, the AI can do that for you. Mastery, today, most people in those jobs have mastery. So they're using these things to optimize their performance, which is great for them because, just take away all the mundane work I don't want to do. But if you're a new hire coming into the workforce in 10 years' time, when the first 10 years of your job can be done by an AI, how do you get to the mastery of the 11th year, right? How do you learn your way up? And how is somebody going to pay you for 10 years when the AI can do it better?
It's a massive societal question, right? I mean, we can only hope that we can leverage these tools into being great trainers.
Yeah.
And that we all just get to a better place, that today is not the place. Today's top performers are not 10 years from now's top performers. They'll be much better because it'll be so much easier, quicker, and more efficient to learn, and maybe learn what we need to, because we can all lean on these reasoning engines now.
It's going to be an interesting journey, right?
It's going to be, I have real questions that are we're not going to be sitting on GPT-4 in 10 years either, right? Like there's a huge arc of advancement happening there. And it almost feels safe that they're going to get an awful lot better. And they're already mind-bogglingly good, these systems. So the pessimist in me is like, why do we need people at that point other than to do the novel, which is important and it's a core function. But then the optimist in me is like, well, I think we'll just get really good at learning what we need to and how to differentiate ourselves from the bots. And I think maybe we all just wind up like a Star Trek episode where we're making pottery and empathic and like really, elevating each other's emotions or something. Like, I don't know, but it feels like it's going to be a different world in 10 years. Like, I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but it's going to be different.
There's an old quote that I use a lot, which is Bill Gates' quote, right? People always overestimate how much can get changed in 1 year and underestimate how much will change in 10.
Yeah.
Probably paraphrasing a little bit, but I think that
I've heard that. Yeah.
Go back 10 years, 2014, right? We weren't even that smartphone-ified at that point, right? We were still, we had apps, but we weren't living on our phone.
We certainly weren't sitting around worried that our 13-year-old daughters were mental health was going through the floor. I mean, the way we think about it now is there's a lot more societal immunity that's been building up. It took some time, but we had a much more, I can even go back further. I remember 1994, the first time I looked at a web browser, 1993. And I said, like, the day Mosaic came out, I remember looking at it and I had this flash of, oh my God, everything's going to change. And I had this vision of it all being like, it was complicated, but I remember thinking, like, on the whole, this is going to be great for democracy. Anyone can publish anything, and here we are 30 years later fighting like mad to like preserve democracy. And 'cause these things have this ability to just change things so much for good and ill that society needs a little bit of time to like figure out how we're going to adapt to it. Like, we're putting in all kinds of safeguards. It's still, into the internet era stuff. And we'll be doing that for the next 30 years for this, AI driven stuff.
I saw a live presentation by Malcolm Gladwell once here in Vancouver, and he was talking about do social networks create change, or do they reinforce the status quo? And his argument was that they reinforce the status quo, and it was a lot about small groups of highly motivated individuals create change, not large, vaguely connected groups of people, which of course is what our social networks is. I wonder if he would change his viewpoint. I wonder if he hadn't factored in. Yeah, but what if you have a social network where 90% of it is bots with a particular viewpoint being injected into them as part of that conversation, and you have no way to disintermediate between bots and humans anymore, because that's the reality we live in now, right? How much networks is bots?
And that would
no.
The irony too, like, this is something that people don't take me seriously, but the most interesting conversations I have, this one exempted, of course, is often with GPT-4, or with Gemini of late, with the right prompting, I can have the most intriguing conversations. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thanks so much for coming on the show. That's all for this episode of your AI Injection. As always, thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode and want to know more about leveraging AI in your products, you can check out a related episode of ours by Googling Xionics Product Management. Also, please feel free to tell your friends about us, give us a review, and check out our past episodes at podcast.xionics.com. That's podcast.xionics.com.